The air over the ragged coastline of occupied France was cold and thin, a vast, unforgiving expanse on the morning of November 26, 1943. At 28,000 feet, the world was a sheet of pale blue, the ground below a hazy patchwork of fields and rivers. In this lethal arena, a formation of B-17 flying fortresses, their aluminum skins glittering in the sun, droned steadily towards their target. But they were not alone. Higher still, watching, waiting, were the hunters. They were the experienced pilots of Jägerschwader II Richthofen, named for the Red Baron himself. In their sleek, powerful Focke-Wulf FW-190s, they were the masters of this sky. From their cockpits, the American bomber escort, a group of new bulky fighters they had come to know as the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt, looked like easy prey. The German pilots had laughed at them, this jug, as the Americans affectionately called it, for its resemblance to a milk jug. To the Germans, it was a clumsy, slow-looking aircraft, seemingly incapable of high-altitude combat. One young German pilot, Unteroffizier Hans Richter, later recalled in his interrogation report the casual confidence they felt. He transmitted over the radio, a smirk in his voice, Achtung Indianer, the German code for enemy fighters. Then he added to his wingman, Die Dicken Jungs sind wieder da. The fat boys are back. The FWS peeled off, diving with the sun at their backs, their radial engines screaming. They expected the Thunderbolts to break, to scatter in confusion. This was their domain. But on this day something was different. The P-47s did not run. They turned into the attack, not with the graceful arc of a dancer, but with the grim, determined pivot of a brawler. Leading the 56th Fighter Group, Major Gerald W. Johnson radioed a simple, calm order: drop tanks. Let's go to work. And then the sky erupted. It was not the sound of a single cannon, but a tearing, ripping, visceral shudder, the sound of 8 Browning M2.50 caliber machine guns firing in unison. A storm of lead, over 1,200 rounds per minute, converged on the diving Focke-Wulfs. The tracers weren't mere streaks. They were a solid, flowing river of fire, a hose of death that sawed through cockpits, shredded wings, and detonated engines. Hans Richter saw his wingman's aircraft simply disintegrate. It was not like being hit by a shell, he would later tell his allied interrogators. It was being erased. One moment he was there, the next there was only pieces. It was a tskaka sound, like a terrible giant ripping of canvas. We had never seen such firepower. The laughter died in their throats, replaced by the cold taste of fear and the frantic, static-filled shouts of warning over the radio. The myth of their invincibility shattered in those few violent seconds. How had they been so wrong? How did this brutish, underestimated machine, an aircraft they had mocked as a failure, suddenly become the most feared predator in the European sky? The answer lies not in a single moment, but in a story of desperation, innovation, and a stubborn refusal to accept defeat. To understand the shock of that November encounter, one must first appreciate the sheer, unshakable confidence of the German Luftwaffe in the early war years. By 1943, they were not just an air force, they were a legend. They had perfected the concept of blitzkrieg, where the Stuka dive bomber became the terrifying siren of destruction, and the Messerschmitt Bf-109 was its swift, lethal guardian. Their pilots were battle-hardened veterans of the Spanish Civil War, the Polish and French campaigns, and the Battle of Britain. They were, by every metric, the most experienced and tactically advanced. Against the growing Allied bomber offensive was the Focke-Wulf FW-190 Werger, or Shrike. It was a masterpiece of engineering. Kurt Tank, its designer, had created a fighter that was brutally effective. Powered by a BMW 801 radial engine, it was faster than the Spitfire Mk.V at low and medium altitudes. It was incredibly rugged, with a wide-track landing gear that made it a stable gun platform and easy to handle on the ground. Most terrifying of all was its armament: 2 7.92mm machine guns in the nose, and 2 20mm MGFF/M cannons in the wing roots, and often 2 more 20mm cannons in the outer wings. A single, well-placed 20mm explosive shell could tear an aircraft apart. The pilots who flew these machines were the heirs to a ruthless doctrine. They were taught to attack from a position of advantage, using the sun and cloud cover. Their preferred method was a high-speed, slashing dive through the bomber formations, using their concentrated cannon fire to devastating effect, then using their speed to climb away and set up for another pass. They were disciplined, aggressive, and believed in the innate superiority of their equipment and their training. When the first P-47 Thunderbolts appeared over Western Europe in early 1943, the German pilots were, frankly, amused. Through intelligence reports and initial cautious encounters, they formed a damning assessment. The Thunderbolt was huge, nearly twice the weight of an FW-190. Its air-cooled R2800 double Wasp engine was powerful, but the aircraft itself was cumbersome. It seemed to lack the rate of climb to intercept them at their preferred altitudes. Early combat reports, now stored in the Bundesarchiv Militararchiv in Freiburg, reveal this dismissive attitude. One German pilot's after-action report from April 1943 stated simply, "The new American fighter is slow to maneuver and cannot follow a climbing or turning attack. It presents a large target. It is not a threat. They gave it derisive nicknames, Die Fliegen Buchs, the flying barrel, or more crudely, Schlechter Witz, bad joke. Their confidence was rooted in experience. They had broken the RAF over Dunkirk, they had fought the best of Britain to a standstill, and now these Americans arrived with what looked like a clumsy, overweight relic. The prevailing wisdom in the Jagerschwader mess halls was that the P-47 was a failure, a plane that could not protect the bombers it was tasked to shepherd. The air war, they believed, was still theirs to command. This overconfidence was a weapon, and the Americans were about to turn it against them. On the other side of the channel, in the damp, muddy airfields of England, a very different reality was taking hold. For the young American pilots of the 8th Air Force, 1943 was a time of brutal, bloody learning. Their mission, to conduct daylight precision bombing of Nazi Germany, was proving to be a slaughterhouse. The early, unescorted raids deep into Germany were catastrophic. Without fighter protection for the entire journey, the B-17 and B-24 formations were savaged by the relentless attacks of the German fighter defenses. The P-47's at first were part of the problem. Their limited range meant they could only escort the bombers to the Dutch border, a line the bomber crews grimly nicknamed the Black Line, or the point of no return. They would watch their little friends, the Jugs, turn back, their fuel running low, and then they would fly on alone into the hell of flak and fighters. The feeling of abandonment was acute. A B-17 pilot, Lieutenant Robert Rosie Rosenthal of the 100th Bomb Group, later recalled in an oral history for the National World War II Museum, "You'd see those Thunderbolts waggle their wings and head for home, and your heart would sink. You knew what was coming. The next 3 hours were going to be a fight for your life." Morale among the fighter groups was also suffering. They were taking heavy losses for seemingly little gain. They knew the bomber crews called them the Abandonment Corps. In his personal diary, now part of the collection at the National Archives, Captain Walker Bud Mahurin of the 56th Fighter Group wrote in the summer of 1943, "We fight like hell to the coast, lose a few good men, and then have to leave the forts to their fate. Feels like we are failing them. The boys are getting frustrated. We have this big, powerful airplane, and we are chained to it by a short leash." The P-47 itself was a source of frustration. Its complex turbo-supercharger system, while brilliant in theory, was prone to teething problems. The aircraft was a challenge to fly, requiring muscle and skill. It demanded a different kind of pilot, not a fencer but a prize fighter. The initial combat tactics, trying to turn with the nimble German fighters, were a disaster. The Thunderbolt could not outturn a Bf-109 or an FW-190 at most altitudes. It was a recipe for defeat. But within this weakness, a fierce determination was forged. The American pilots, mechanics, and commanders were a different breed. They were not products of a rigid military caste. They were civilians in uniform, tinkerers, engineers, and farm boys who understood machinery. They possessed a raw, pragmatic ingenuity. They began to experiment, to adapt. They stopped trying to fight the German way and started figuring out how to fight the P-47's way. They knew their aircraft was tough. They knew it could dive like a runaway train. And they knew that when its 8 guns spoke, nothing in the sky could withstand its fury. They just needed a way to unleash it. The stage was set for a revolution, not just in technology, but in thought. The answer was coming, born from a simple, desperate question. How do we make the Jug go farther and hit harder? The revolution did not arrive with a single silver bullet invention, but through a combination of 3 critical innovations. One technological, one tactical, and one remarkably simple piece of field modification. Together, they transformed the P-47 from a defensive liability into the most dominant escort fighter of the war. The first and most profound was the technological marvel at the heart of the Thunderbolt, the turbo supercharger. While German fighters relied on mechanical superchargers that lost power rapidly above 20,000 feet, the P-47 system was different. Designed by General Electric, it used the aircraft's exhaust gases to spin a turbine, which in turn powered a centrifugal supercharger, forcing dense air into the massive Pratt & Whitney R2800 engine. This system allowed the Thunderbolt to maintain its phenomenal power, over 2,000 horsepower, all the way up to 30,000 feet and beyond. At the very altitudes where the B-17s flew, the P-47 was not a sluggish whale. It was a powerhouse. The Germans, whose fighters' performance fell off a cliff above 25,000 feet, had completely misjudged this. They were fighting the Jug at its worst altitude, not its best. But power and altitude performance were useless if the fighter couldn't reach the fight. The second innovation was the external fuel tank. The initial P-47s had a combat radius of only about 175 miles. The solution was crude but effective. Strap a disposable fuel tank to the belly of the aircraft. The first models were made of pressed paper and they were unreliable. But soon, the engineers at Republic Aviation, working hand in hand with the crews in England, developed metal 75-gallon and then 108-gallon drop tanks. These tanks allowed the P-47 to carry extra fuel for the journey. Or when enemy fighters were engaged, the pilot could jettison them, instantly transforming the laden fighter into a clean, agile combat machine. This extended the Thunderbolt's reach deep into Germany, finally allowing it to shepherd the bombers all the way to their targets and back. It was a simple idea, but it broke the chains that had bound the 8th Air Force. The third innovation was tactical, pioneered by visionaries like Colonel Hubert Hub Zemke, commander of the 56th Fighter Group. Zemke and others realized that trying to dogfight the FW-190 was suicide. The Thunderbolt's advantage was not in the turn, but in the vertical. They developed the boom and zoom tactic. Flying in elements of 4 from high altitude, they would spot the German fighters below. They would then boom, diving at incredible speeds, often exceeding 500 miles per hour, using the P-47's legendary dive capability to compress the air and make it difficult for the German pilots to follow. They would make a single, slashing pass, their 8 guns unleashing a 1 to 2 second burst, enough to saturate an area the size of a house with .50 caliber rounds. Then they would zoom, using their tremendous speed and momentum to climb back to a position of altitude advantage, safe from any counterattack. It was a hit-and-run tactic that played perfectly to the aircraft's strengths: power, speed in the dive, and devastating firepower. And that firepower was the final piece of the puzzle. The 8 M2.50 caliber machine guns, with 267 rounds per gun, provided an unprecedented volume of fire. While the German 20mm cannon was devastating, it had a slower rate of fire and limited ammunition. The .50 caliber round, though smaller, was a highly effective projectile. It could penetrate armor, shred aluminum, and destroy engines. More importantly, the concentration of 8 guns meant a pilot didn't need to be a crack shot. He simply had to point his aircraft in the general direction of the enemy, and the hailstorm of lead would do the rest. As one pilot from the 78th Fighter Group put it, "You didn't aim at the enemy fighter, you aimed at the patch of sky he was about to fly through." By the time he got there, that patch of sky was full of lead. This combination, the high-altitude turbo-supercharger, the range-extending drop tank, the revolutionary boom and zoom tactics, and the overwhelming firepower, created a new kind of weapon system. The Germans, still laughing at the flying barrel, were about to face a predator they had not anticipated, one that struck from the one place they thought was safe: the deep, cold sky above. The late autumn of 1943 was a period of intense preparation and grim anticipation across the air bases of eastern England. At fields like RAF Horsham St. Faith, Boxted, and Halesworth, the mood was shifting from one of frustration to one of focused determination. The new tools had arrived. The long-range drop tanks were being fitted to the P-47's in ever-increasing numbers. In the briefing huts, intelligence officers like Captain James B. Jimmy Stewart of the 4th Fighter Group, not the movie star but a brilliant analyst in his own right, pored over reconnaissance photos identifying flak batteries and potential fighter airfields along the routes to targets deep in the Reich. The pilots, no longer the green replacements of a few months prior, were now veterans of dozens of missions. They spent their evenings not in the pubs, but in cramped ready rooms, hunched over blackboards, practicing the new Zemke fan and boom and zoom tactics. They studied the silhouettes of German aircraft until they could identify a Focke-Wulf 190 from a Messerschmitt 109 at 5 miles, in a split second. They learned the weaknesses: aim for the FW-190's oil cooler under the nose, or the BF-109's vulnerable radiator under the wing. They trusted their aircraft, this big, brutish jug that could bring them home even when it was shot to pieces. The ground crews worked through the cold, foggy nights, their breath misting in the glow of trouble lights. They were the unsung heroes, the Kirus, as they were called. They tuned the complex turbo-supercharger systems, ensured the gun bays were clean and the ammunition belts loaded without a single kink. They painted victory flags, swastikas, and now, increasingly, silhouettes of FW-190s below the cockpits. A sense of shared purpose bonded the pilots and their crews. They were no longer just fighting a war, they were proving a point. On the evening of November 25th, the orders for a major raid on the industrial city of Bremen were posted. The atmosphere was electric. The meteorologists predicted clear skies over the target. The intelligence briefings were stark. They expected the Luftwaffe to throw everything it had at them. This would not be a skirmish. It would be a battle of annihilation. That night, few men slept well. In his letters home, later published in the book Thunderbolt, a pilot's story, Lieutenant Robert S. Johnson of the 56th Fighter Group wrote, "You lie in your cot and you think about the flak black and thick. You think about the 109s and 190s, and you wonder if you'll see one in time. You think about the guys who aren't here anymore. And then you stop thinking and you just pray. You pray for the dawn, and you pray for the strength to do your job." Before first light, the crews were awake. The pre-flight rituals were performed with solemn focus. The pilots ate a quiet breakfast, the traditional pre-mission meal of eggs and bacon. They dressed in their electrically heated suits, pulled on their leather jackets and Mae West life preservers. They were driven to their waiting aircraft aircraft, standing like silent, hulking beasts in the pre-dawn gloom. The crew chiefs handed them their parachutes and gave them a thumbs up. The engines coughed, sputtered, then roared to life, the thunder of 100 double wasps shaking the very earth. One by one they taxied out, forming long, snaking lines towards the runway. The green flare arced into the sky from the control tower. It was the signal. The first element of Thunderbolts began their roll, gathering speed, their heavy frames reluctantly lifting into the gray English sky. They were climbing towards the sun, towards a rendezvous with the bombers, and towards a confrontation that would change the air war over Europe forever. The calm was over. The storm was beginning. The great armada formed up over the North Sea, a breathtaking and terrifying sight. Hundreds of B-17's stacked in combat boxes, their contrails painting long white scars across the sky. And weaving around them, climbing steadily to their high cover positions, were the P-47's of the 4th, 56th, and 78th fighter groups. Today they were not turning back. Slung beneath their bellies were the 108-gallon metal drop tanks, giving them the range to push deep into Germany. As the formation crossed the Dutch coast, the first inaccurate puffs of flak began to appear, black tulips, the crews called them, blooming in the cold air. The radio, which had been a steady hum of navigation checks, fell silent. This was the zone of danger. They flew on, the only sound the constant, droning roar of the engines. Near Oldenburg, the first warnings crackled over the VHF radio. Bandits, 10 o'clock high. It was the forward sweep of the 56th, led by Hub Zenke himself. High above the bombers, they spotted the glint of sunlight on canopies, a mixed group of about 40 FW-190s and BF-109s, positioning for a classic head-on attack against the lead, almost conversational. Drop tanks, Thunderbirds, follow me. A cascade of silver tanks tumbled away from the P-47's, spinning down towards the earth. Relieved of their weight, the jugs leaped forward. They climbed, using their superior high-altitude performance to gain an extra 2,000 feet on the Germans. What happened next was a perfect execution of the new doctrine. The Germans, focused on the bombers, had not seen the diving Thunderbolts. Zenke's flight picked their targets. They didn't turn, they dove. The airspeed indicators on the P-47's wound past 400, 450, 500 miles per hour. The aircraft began to buffet, the controls growing stiff with compressibility. They were falling out of the sky like avenging angels. Unteroffizier Richter, from his cockpit in the German formation, saw them too late. I saw these specks high above, and then they grew with impossible speed. They were not flying, they were falling. And then I saw the flashes on their wings. The sound was not that of individual guns, but a continuous, ripping roar. 8 guns per aircraft, from a flight of 8, created a wall of projectiles. The .50 caliber rounds, a mix of armor-piercing, incendiary, and tracer, converged on the lead element of FW-190s. Richter saw 2 of them simply come apart. Wings folded back, canopies shattered, engines erupted in smoke and flame. The disciplined German formation disintegrated into a swirling, chaotic melee. But this was not a turning fight. As the P-47's blasted through the formation, they didn't slow down. They used their incredible dive speed to flash through the enemy, safe from any effective return fire. Then, following their training, they began to zoom, climbing back up to reset for another pass. The Germans, shocked by the speed and ferocity of the attack, were now the ones reacting, not acting. The battle broke into a series of individual duels, but they were duels fought on American terms. Lieutenant Robert S. Johnson found himself separated, a single FW-190 on his tail. He couldn't outturn it. Instead, he firewalled the throttle and nosed over into a vertical dive. The FW-190 followed, but the Thunderbolt was the undisputed master of the dive. As the airspeed redlined, the German pilot, his aircraft shaking violently, was forced to pull out. Johnson, his aircraft still stable, rolled and pulled back into a steep climb, now reversing the rolls. He later wrote, "That jug could dive away from anything. It was our salvation." Meanwhile, Captain Walter Beckham of the 353rd Fighter Group, leading his squadron lower to engage another group of 109s, demonstrated the jug's resilience. His aircraft was hit by 20mm cannon fire, which tore a hole in the wing large enough to crawl through. Shrapnel damaged his turbo-supercharger and wounded him in the leg, but the P-47 kept flying. He managed to shoot down one of his attackers and, despite his crippled aircraft and injury, flew the nearly 300 miles back to his base in England, a testament to the aircraft's legendary toughness. For over 40 minutes, the sky over the German countryside was a scene of unimaginable chaos and violence. The steady drone of the bombers was punctuated by the scream of diving fighters, the crump of flak, and the frantic calls of pilots. But slowly, inevitably, the tide turned. The P-47's, using their speed, altitude, and firepower, were systematically dismantling the Luftwaffe's attack. The German pilots, trained for a different kind of war, found themselves helpless against an enemy that refused to fight on their terms. They would dive on a jug, only to see it power away in a dive they could not follow. They would try to climb away, only to find the heavy American fighter, powered by its turbo-supercharger, climbing with them them and then above them, setting up for another lethal pass. By the time the bomber stream turned for home, the sky belonged to the Thunderbolts. The Luftwaffe, bloodied and bewildered, broke off the engagement. The P-47's, some low on fuel and ammunition, reformed and took up their stations alongside the bombers. They had not just protected them, they had achieved a decisive victory. The official after-action report from the 56th Fighter Group, filed that evening, claimed 18 enemy aircraft destroyed, 3 probables and 7 damaged for the loss of only 2 of their own. The laughter had died. In its place was a new, grim respect. The return to their bases in France and Germany was a somber affair for the German pilots who had survived the mauling over Oldenburg and Bremen. The mood in the debriefing rooms was one of stunned disbelief. The intelligence officers, expecting reports of downed bombers and easy victories over the clumsy P-47's, were instead faced with shaken, angry pilots describing a new and terrifying adversary. The after-action reports from Jägerschwader 2 and JG-26 from late November and December 1943, now available for study, reveal a dramatic shift in tone. The dismissive comments about the flying barrel are gone. In their place are alarmed assessments. One report, dated December 2, 1943, states, "The enemy fighter escorts are now appearing in strength deep into Reich territory. The P-47, which was previously considered inferior, has proven to be a highly dangerous opponent, particularly at high altitude. Its diving speed is exceptional, making it impossible to catch or escape. Its armament is devastating. Our losses have increased significantly." The shock was not just tactical, it was psychological. The Luftwaffe's confidence, its very identity, was built on technical and tactical superiority. Now that foundation was cracking. The pilots who had once joked about the P-47 now spoke of it with a wary respect. They gave it a new nickname, Der Dick, the Fat One. It was no longer a term of derision, but one of acknowledgement. You didn't mock the Fat One, you feared it. Interrogations of captured German pilots, conducted by Allied intelligence and documented in files at the National Archives, consistently highlighted 2 things: the shock of the P-47's firepower and its dive capability. Oberleutnant Franz Stigler, a high-scoring ace with JG-27 who was shot down by a P-47 in early 1944, told his captors, "When you are hit by a 20mm, it is a hammer blow. But when you are hit by the American .50 calibers, it is like being put through a shredder. The amount of metal in the air is unbelievable. There is no escaping it." The German high command was slow to react. Adolf Galland, the General der Jagdflieger, saw the warning signs. He pleaded for resources, for new aircraft designs that could counter the American escort fighters, for a shift in strategy. But the Nazi war machine, already stretched to its limits on the Eastern Front and in the Mediterranean, was incapable of the rapid, pragmatic innovation that characterized the American effort. They were still producing updated versions of the Bf-109, an aircraft whose basic design was a decade old. The collapse was not a single event, but a gradual erosion. Pilot morale suffered. The experienced aces, the Experten, began to fall one by one, replaced by poorly trained youngsters who were shot down on their first few missions. The loss of these veterans was a blow from which the Jagdwaffe would never truly recover. The air superiority that Germany had enjoyed for so long was slipping from its grasp, and the P-47 Thunderbolt was the primary instrument of its demise. The Hunter-7's transformation in the autumn of 1943 reverberated far beyond the dogfights over Europe. It was a strategic turning point of the highest order. The successful introduction of long-range escort fighters fundamentally altered the calculus of the Allied air campaign. The most immediate and vital effect was the plummeting loss rate of the B-17 and B-24 bombers. Before the P-47's could escort all the way to the target, a bombing raid could expect to lose 5, 10, even 15% of its aircraft, unsustainable losses. By early 1944, with the P-47's and the newly arriving P-51 Mustangs providing continuous escort, those loss rates dropped to below 2%. This meant that the 8th Air Force could now prosecute its strategic bombing campaign with devastating effect. The around-the-clock bombing, the RAF by night, the USAAF by day, was now a reality, systematically dismantling the German war machine's factories, oil refineries, and transportation networks. This had a direct and catastrophic impact on the Luftwaffe. The need to defend the Reich forced the German fighters to come up and fight on Allied terms. They could no longer pick and choose their engagements. They were bled white in what the German pilots grimly called the Great Slaughter. The official U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey after the war concluded that the defeat of the Luftwaffe in the defense of the Reich was the single most important contribution of the air war to the Allied victory in Europe, and the P-47 was the workhorse that bore the brunt of that fighting throughout the critical period of late 1943 and early 1944. Politically, this success vindicated the American doctrine of daylight precision bombing, a strategy that had been heavily criticized after the early disastrous raids. It gave President Roosevelt and Prime Minister Churchill the confidence to proceed with the planning of Operation Overlord, the D-Day invasion. They knew that the Luftwaffe would be unable to mount a significant threat to the invasion fleet or the troops on the beaches. Air superiority over Normandy was not a hope, it was a guarantee paid for in blood and steel by the pilots of the Thunderbolt and other escort fighters. The news of the air victories began to filter back to the American public. Newspapers like the New York Times and Chicago Tribune ran stories on the fighting jugs and their aces. Men like Francis Gabby Gabreski, Robert S. Johnson, and Hubert Zenke became household names. Their exploits and the rugged image of the P-47 became a powerful propaganda tool and a massive morale booster for a nation weary of war. The P-47 was proof that American ingenuity and industrial might could and would prevail. In Germany, the relentless bombing, made possible by the escort fighters, shattered civilian morale and crippled industrial production. Albert Speer, the Reich Minister of Armaments and War Production, wrote in his memoirs that the fighter escorts were the deadliest threat and that the loss of the air war was the decisive factor in Germany's defeat. The P-47, the plane the Germans had laughed at, had become a central actor in the downfall of the Third Reich. The legacy of the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt is immense, enduring far beyond the final victory in Europe. It stands as a timeless lesson in the perils of underestimation and the power of adaptive innovation. In the annals of military aviation, the P-47 statistics speak for themselves. It was the most produced American fighter of the war, with over 15,600 built. Of the top American aces in the European theater, the majority scored more of their victories in the P-47 than in any other aircraft. It was also one of the most versatile aircraft of the war. While it excelled as a high-altitude escort fighter, it found its true calling as a devastatingly effective fighter bomber. In the months after D-Day, equipped with underwing rockets and up to 2,500 pounds of bombs, the Jug became the close air support workhorse of the Allied armies. It roamed the battlefield in France, the Low Countries, and Germany, destroying tanks, trains, artillery positions, and troop concentrations with brutal efficiency. General George S. Patton would later remark that the P-47 pilots were the bravest men in my army. The aircraft's design philosophy, ruggedness, survivability, and overwhelming firepower influenced a generation of American military aircraft. You can see the spirit of the Jug in the post-war Douglas A-1 Skyraider, a prop-driven ground attack aircraft known for its toughness, and even in the modern A-10 Thunderbolt II, which carries the same name and is built around a massive, tank-busting rotary cannon, echoing the P-47's concept of concentrated firepower. The story of its turnaround also serves as a classic case study in military doctrine, taught at war colleges like West Point and Sandhurst. It is a prime example of how technological advantage is meaningless without the correct tactics to exploit it. The boom and zoom doctrine developed for the P-47 remains a fundamental principle of air combat to this day. The development of the drop tank, a seemingly simple innovation, revolutionized the strategic reach of air power, a lesson that has informed every conflict since. For the men who flew it, the P-47 was more than a machine. It was a brother in arms. Veteran after veteran, in interviews for museums like the National Museum of the United States Air Force and the Smithsonian, has spoken of the aircraft with a near-reverent affection. They credit its incredible toughness with saving their lives on countless occasions. Stories of Jugs returning home with cylinders shot off, wings in tatters, and tails nearly severed are legion. It earned a reputation as the aircraft that could take a beating and still bring its pilot home. Today, the P-47's legacy is preserved by dedicated historians and enthusiasts. A handful of airworthy examples still fly at air shows, their distinctive radial engine roar a powerful echo of the past. Museums around the world display them, from the Udvar-Hazy Center in Virginia to the Imperial War Museum in Duxford, England, where one stands in silent tribute to the men of the 8th Air Force. Historians like Dr. Richard P. Hollion, former Air Force historian, have analyzed its impact extensively. In his book Storm over Iraq, Air Power and the Gulf War, he draws a direct line from the tactical innovation of World War II fighter bombers like the P-47 to the precision air power of the modern era. The Jug proved that air power could be the decisive factor on the battlefield, not just in strategic bombing, but in direct support of the troops on the ground. The story of the P-47 is a rebuttal to the idea that war is won by the most elegant or technologically sophisticated weapon. It was won by the right weapon, used in the right way by determined men who refused to accept failure. It is a story of how a flying bathtub outfought the best the enemy had to offer, and in doing so, helped to win a war and shape the future of combat in the sky. The story of the P-47 Thunderbolt is, at its heart, a story about perception and reality. It is a cautionary tale about the deadly sin of arrogance, and a triumphant saga of resilience and adaptation. The Germans saw a clumsy, ugly aircraft and laughed. They saw only what they wanted to see, a confirmation of their own superiority. But beneath that ungainly exterior lay a masterpiece of power, potential, and rugged strength, waiting only for the right moment and the right beyond the airfields of World War II. It is a universal lesson. It teaches teaches us that true strength is not always flaunted, that innovation often springs from desperation, and that the will to adapt is a more powerful weapon than any cannon. The American pilots and engineers, faced with a seemingly insurmountable problem, did not give up. They studied, they tinkered, they experimented, and they fought with what they had, until they forged a weapon of victory from an instrument of defeat. The courage of those young pilots, climbing into their cockpits day after day, knowing the odds that awaited them over Fortress Europe, is humbling. They flew into flak so thick you could walk on it, they dueled with the most experienced pilots in the world, and they trusted their lives to a machine that was only just revealing its true nature. They were civilians who became warriors, and in their hands the Thunderbolt found its voice, not a graceful song, but the roaring, tearing, undeniable thunder of freedom. The legacy of the Jug is etched into the history of air power, but it is also carved into the memory of a generation. It stands as a monument to the idea that it is not the weapon that wins the war, but the spirit of the one who wields it. The P-47 was more than metal and wire and guns. It was the physical embodiment of the American industrial spirit and the unwavering determination of the greatest generation. Perhaps the most fitting summary comes from one of the men who knew it best, Colonel Hubert "Hub" Zenke, the tactical genius who helped unlock the Thunderbolt's potential. His words, recorded after the war, resonate with the hard-won wisdom of experience. The Luftwaffe made one fatal mistake. They judged the Thunderbolt by its looks and not by its performance. In war, as in life, that is a mistake you only make once. And so, the laughter that once echoed in the skies of Europe faded, replaced by the enduring roar of the Jug, a sound that heralded not mockery but liberation. A sound that reminds us that courage, ingenuity, and a refusal to quit can turn even the most underestimated of tools into a hammer that forges history.